Chapter 5. My saving grace during this time was the group of friends I made through a local church. Not long before I joined, the church was burnt down by local religious Jews who hated having such an abomination in their neighborhood. In order for the church to continue, a giant tent was placed in the parking lot, and the meetings were held in there. The congregation had a core group of local people who attended weekly, as well as visitors who came and went as they visited Jerusalem. It didn't take long for me to make friends. As far as I was concerned, the cornerstone of this church was a woman called Liz. Her official role was as the wife of the pastor, as well as the piano player. However, Liz was so much more than that. She was the pulse of the church, the heart. In a congregation full of biblical experts and Dead Sea Scroll researchers, Liz imparted a sense of love and acceptance and gave the Bible a practical outlet in her humanitarian take on life. Liz looked like $1 million. Her body defied age, her makeup was flawless, she wore heels that I had only seen in magazines, and her skirts were shockingly short. She had the glint in her eye of a woman who was soaking up all that life had to offer. I absolutely adored her. Despite being the mother of 5 children, she always had time for me. She invited me into her home, and her home became my sanctuary. Liz and her family had a young man living at their house as well. John was originally from Colorado, but had lived in Jerusalem for a few years and was studying at the university. He was madly in love with Dahlia, the oldest daughter, and he became a bit of a handyman for the busy household. John and I became friends. If for some reason I couldn't stay in the apartment above anymore, I would go downstairs and sit with John. We would make popcorn and chat about life. Often he would have to study, so I would just sit there with him, listening to his music collection, waiting for him to have a break from his studies. John became the father, uncle, brother that I never had. He was the first male I knew who didn't scare me, the first male who didn't use his gender as a way to intimidate or overpower me. He was kind, considerate, and incredibly generous with his time. He was also witty, and I loved our conversations. He would tell me about his childhood adventures. He loved the mountains and the desert. His stories told me of a world that was out there ready to be explored. Not once did he make me feel like I was taking up his time or distracting him from his work. He never made me feel that our 14-year age gap meant that we couldn't be friends. He had no agenda. He was just a friend, and I had never experienced such kindness before. As our friendship grew, so too did his connection to my brother Sam and to our gang of friends from the church. Our youth group had leaders that the church provided through a volunteer program run by the Southern Baptist Union in the States. They were lovely young people who fulfilled their contracts, but no one compared to John. We all adored him. It was impossible to separate John from his love of music. It was so much part of him, and the more time we spent with John, the more his love of music rubbed off on us. His guitar playing was contagious. Sam and his friends all started to play an instrument. My friend Danya from youth group was a gifted piano player and a beautiful singer, and she would join us when her parents let her have a break from her homework. She seemed to be the only one of us who had to focus on her studies. After a while, Liz got us all to lead worship at church on Saturday mornings. Danya would often take over from Liz on the piano. I would sing with whoever else was available that day. Sam would play the bass guitar, Danny on the drums, and Micah on the guitar. Any free time we had, we would sit and jam with John in his basement. Sometimes he would pull out the banjo and take us back to his time around the campfire in Colorado. Those were the happiest times of my life. Our summers would be spent at camp, initially as campers, but then as the years passed as camp leaders. And then when that wasn't enough, I would do the kitchen duty for the Arabic-speaking camps, just so I didn't have to leave the camp and go back home. I had finally found a place where I belonged. I had a group of friends that I connected with, and as the oldest in the group, I had a bit of a mother role, and it suited me perfectly. John thrived as our mentor. Dahlia had yet to see the light about what an incredible man John was, so he had plenty of time for us teenagers. When he was free from his university studies, we would all pile into a van, and John would drive us out to the desert to get us away from the pressures of Jerusalem. There he would take us on long hikes during the hot days. I would still be wearing my beloved jumpers despite the temperatures being above 40 degrees Celsius. At night, he would teach us how to make fires, and once it was going, the marshmallows were roasting, we would listen to stories and learn new songs. At other times, John would tell us to hop into the van, and he would drive us north to one of his favorite swimming spots. We would spend the rest of the day in a magical waterhole surrounded by high cliffs. John would show off his diving skills, and the boys would try and copy his crazy moves. He would also take us up to the mountains around the Dead Sea. We would climb through dry river beds and slide down rock formations. We camped on the beach in Gaza. We had night hikes in the Judean hills. We explored monasteries that were carved out in the mountainside, where we had to walk carefully along tiny paths that hugged steep cliffs. Underground hideaways were also a favorite for John. We would squeeze through tunnels that eventually led to big caverns and cisterns. He would then pull out candles from his backpack, and we would sit around and sing and listen to our voices echo through the many pockets of the tunnel. If there was something to teach us, he would. He was learning so much at the university, and he wanted to share it with us. Sometimes he would find a piece of pottery on the ground in our travels and explain that this was a piece from the Byzantine period. He made history come alive. I will never forget one of our desert hikes in the Negev desert. It went on for hours. The sun was beating down on us and we were exhausted. All of us, that is, except for John. As usual, he was walking with a spring in his step, his face beaming at us, taking us out of our comfort zones. He never slowed down. Initially, we sang to distract ourselves or give each other riddles to solve. We tried to make the time pass, but as the hours went on, we were exhausted. John just kept saying that it was all worth it and a river would be waiting for us. We were all so excited about being able to swim and cool off. Then, to our horror, when we got to the river, John explained, as we looked at the dry patch of sand, that it was in fact an ancient river that had flowed thousands of years earlier. He loved these lessons he had for us. Thankfully, John made up for it by taking his backpack off and pulling out a giant watermelon. He had carried his heavy lump for the whole hike, knowing full well that we would need a happy surprise to keep us walking back to camp. After one of our tunnel adventures, John took us to a field that was filled with poppies and beautiful wildflowers. Once we had run around and posed for photos, he told us how this was the place where David defeated Goliath, adding his own twist to the story and making us connect with the scriptures in a way that made it all feel so real. John stretched our knowledge and showed us what living a life of integrity really meant. The boys in our group were challenged to treat women with respect. Us girls were given the gift of seeing what a real man was like. He never demanded our respect, but he had all of us wrapped around his finger. All these adventures with John were so different to the intensity of the life we had in Jerusalem. The political unrest and the intense personalities of stressed out people. The trips with John gave us much needed escape, a sense of freedom and adventure. In the beginning of 1990, Liz had some very big news for us. She was pregnant with twins. I was elated. My role as their family helper intensified as there was even more I could do. I used to feel that Liz's house was the center of the universe. I still do. It's hard to describe their dynamic home. People from all around the world were always coming and going at all hours. Their round, tiny kitchen table that was meant to host 4 people would often have a swelling crowd of 20 mingled around it. Liz would always seem to find a way of feeding everyone, and in the most relaxed manner I had ever experienced. Her potato and cauliflower soup could easily feed a room full of people with the addition of extra water and a few more potatoes. Her spicy green bean stew just needed to be served with another bag of pita bread from the corner shop if there were more mouths to feed. And no weekend meal was complete without a massive batch of her famous caramel popcorn. I wanted to be part of the excitement and the pulse that I felt beating through the house. Doing the dishes there was effortless for me. Sorting out cupboards to make space for more food was a joy. I did it all to help Liz out with something I knew wasn't her strong point. It also meant I didn't have to go home, so I often worked long into the evening. I loved every moment I was there, then very late in the evening I would eventually have to go home. One minor obstacle I had to overcome was that the best bus option for me meant I needed to get to a bus stop on Hebron Road. It wasn't the safest option. It would have been much easier if I could have just used the bus stop outside their house on Bethlehem Road. Hebron Road had a different feel. It had a lot more traffic and a lot more workers coming in from neighboring villages. I was a young blonde female and a very easy target. I had so many cars either slow down or follow me as I walked to the bus stop, or men coming out to talk to me, that I had to figure something out. My mother told me that I needed to carry pepper in my pocket and throw it at their faces as they approached. I knew that wouldn't work. I would end up throwing it on myself. Coordination had never been my strong point. I found the answer in a very simple way. As soon as I came around the corner from Bethlehem Road and got onto Hebron Road, I transformed into an old lady with a severely disabled leg. I would hunch over as far as I could go, and then in the most dramatic way, start dragging one of my legs behind me. It meant that I had to walk. It meant that the walk to the bus stop took about 4 times as long, but I didn't mind. I never got honked at or stopped at again. In August 1990, Liz's twins were born, and I had the absolute joy of being there to hold them in hospital. These 2 little babies all bundled up meant the world to me. Liz was beaming. There was no evidence that she had just given birth, no sign of exhaustion or being overwhelmed. Veronica, when it's your turn to have a baby, just think of it as a big poo. I was shocked at her frankness. Talking about a bodily function was total taboo in my world. I didn't respond, but I stored the words away in case I needed them for later. Not that I thought I would ever need to. I had pretty much decided that being a nun was my destiny. Not a nun in the monastery sense, but it did seem the most obvious path, since it meant that my body would never have to be acknowledged or addressed. I could continue having everything from my chin down totally switched off. It made perfect sense to me. My friends started calling me the nun as well. They were having boyfriends and exploring their sexuality, while I was well and truly not going to get involved with any of that. Jesus was my lover. He completed me. I only desired him. I would often lead Bible studies for the youth group, and my messages were heartfelt and true. I really did believe the things I spoke of. I had the integrity of someone who wholeheartedly wanted only one thing, and that was to be consumed by Jesus. I knew that I was a bit of an enigma at my school, and that I made my classmates feel a bit uncomfortable with my black and white views on the world. Unfortunately, that was just how things were. Nothing was going to sway me away from the path of purity and devotion. My absolute favorite teacher, Miss Fail, started a prayer group before school. It gave me yet another outlet to spend time with Jesus as well as with her. I connected with her. She had also moved around the globe as a child, and there was a sadness in her that resonated with me. I doubt many people saw that sadness because she was such a beam of light at our school, always with a smile, her eyes sparkling with genuine care for third culture kids in her class. This early morning prayer group was not as popular to the masses as it was to me. And most mornings it was just me and another student, Karen, sitting there with Miss Fail. Those prayer sessions were meaningful to me. I adored Karen. She was everything I wanted to be. Beautiful, caring, softly spoken, and always ready to say something kind. I felt a connection with her that went beyond the fact that our 2 older sisters were best friends. In my heart, I knew that she was one of the few at school whose devotion to Jesus matched mine. Like me, she was a true believer and follower. It wasn't just something she did to please her parents or to follow some rules. It was real, and in my black and white world, that held a lot of weight. It was during this time that the political unrest in the Middle East was reaching a climax. It had always been strained, especially since the Intifada began in 1987. But this was different. This was bigger. The rumbles of war brewing were getting louder and louder as we were told that Saddam Hussein was going to blow Israel off the map. Initially, these things were just taken as empty threats, but as the months passed, it seemed to take on a life of its own. More and more of my friends were being told to leave the country. The missionary kids were pulled out and had to fly back to their countries. The diplomats and United Nations kids followed. We were instructed on how to set up a shelter in our apartments. It had to be sealed so that no toxic poisons would leak through when the missiles hit. Missiles? Poisons? This was new to me. This wasn't a random bomb in the local shuk or a suicide bomb on a specific bus. I was used to preparing myself for that. This was a whole new reality. This was danger on a very large scale. I tried to ignore thinking about it, and for as long as I could, but by Christmas 1990, you could almost feel the tension in the air. As my youth group went off to Bethlehem to be part of the Christmas celebrations, I was more than happy to stay back and look after the twins that I loved. Liz had trusted me with the role of the babysitter for the event, and I wasn't going to let her down. I spent the evening on my own with the twins, wondering if it was going to be my last Christmas. I felt sad that I would never experience a Swedish Yule with more fire again. I longed for another Christmas in their house, where it got dark by 3 in the afternoon. I remember the candles in the windows with the lit star dangling above, the beautifully decorated tree, the smell of Murmur's meatballs, the table full of her delicious food. It was a magic that could never be duplicated, and I longed to have it again. But here I was, 16 years old, and possibly facing death if Saddam had his way. By now, I didn't go anywhere without a gas mask. We had to carry it in a box with a strap, and it had to be with us at all times. I had won the gas mask box decorating competition at school, which I assume was one of the teacher's ideas to lift morale. I was quite proud of my decorated box. I had transformed it into a dog, complete with a head, 4 legs that made it stand up, as well as a wagging tail. It was quite a work of art, and I had many looks as I had this dog strapped to me everywhere I went, the tail wagging as I walked. In the middle of January 1991, I woke up to the sound of a siren blaring just outside our apartment window. It was deafening and terrifying. Its sound went up and down, louder and louder. The message was clear: get into your shelter now. We all jumped out of our beds at lightning speed, scrambled into our safety room, and started to seal the doors with tape and wet towels. The windows had already been sealed in preparation, covered in plastic bags and thick tape. It almost surprised me that my dad had allowed my mother to do this, since in my mind, God was our protector, and there was nothing we could really do to save ourselves. But hey, it was nice to be just like everyone else for the first time as a family and actually follow the rules. After the initial rush of adrenaline and after getting the room sealed, there wasn't much left to do. I looked over and I could see my mother trying to calm Abigail. She was terrified. She was only 7 years old, and this was so hard for her. As we waited for the all-clear siren to release us, my mind drifted across Jerusalem. I was thinking about the twins, Jesse and Annika. Were they okay? I knew that it would be hard for them. They were too small to have a gas mask. Instead, they needed to be put into a plastic tent, not any bigger than something you would carry a cat to the vet in. How Liz was going to do that while wearing a gas mask and not totally freak Jesse and Annika out, I had no idea. I just wished I could be there and comfort them. Thankfully, we were eventually allowed back to our beds, and I remember thinking that this war had better be over soon, because sitting in a tiny room with my family was nerve-wracking. It was so rare that we were all together as a family, and the chance of my dad or one of my brothers blowing up seemed more real to me than a Scud missile crashing through our apartment. The next couple of days, everyone swapped stories of how they reacted when the sirens started. There were only about 20 students at our school by now, so classes were suspended. We had a lot of free time and basically just hung out together. I loved it. Academics were never an interest of mine. I loved learning from life itself by talking to people and hearing their stories. School seemed so pointless. We had recently started talking about career options in class. We even had someone come into the school to speak to us about which path we wanted to take with our career. Everyone in my class had to say what profession they were hoping to pursue. I had classmates that wanted to be pilots. Quite a few were interested in international law. A couple of psychologists, doctors. Others were interested in the hotel industry. When it was my turn to answer, I said, with a completely serious face, I want to be a beach bum. My poor teacher was horrified. It was kind of true, though. It wasn't that I wasn't going to be a beach bum as such, but a beach bum for Jesus. A big difference. I was going to move to the Solomon Islands and spread the good news to the natives. An Australian missionary had come to our church in Jerusalem. His message struck a chord with me. We had talked for a long time after. He invited me to come to the Solomon Islands with him and his family after I finished school. That sounded so exciting. Up until then, I had visions of me being a nun in the deserts of the Middle East, possibly shining my light for Jesus to the Bedouins who still hadn't heard of the good news. Being a beach bum for Jesus on a tropical island had a much nicer sound to it. It was during this very devoted to Jesus time in my life that I asked my dad if I could get my ear pierced again. I had initially pierced them when I was 14, but I really liked the look of the girls at school who had a second piercing. My dad was horrified. How could I possibly want a second piercing?
Veronica, no daughter of mine is going to have 2 holes in her ears. What's next? You getting your nose pierced? And then what? Are you going to start selling your body on the street?
Bam. There it was again. My dad assuming something about me just because I was female. My sexuality was obviously totally out of control. I was some wild animal who had just been busting to throw myself at men for their pleasure. My cheeks burned with anger, and I knew that it was pointless trying to explain myself. But it hurt. It really hurt. How could my father know so little about me? How could he not know that my friends called me a nun, that I was known for my purity, that I had no intention of anyone ever seeing my body? I hated my body even more than he did. It was not going to see the light of day. He had absolutely nothing to worry about. The Gulf War continued over for the next few weeks. Eventually, it felt like too much effort to go into the shelter. The Scuds were mainly hitting Tel Aviv. Liz and her family seemed to have a pretty relaxed view of the Scuds as well after a few weeks of trying to get their twins into their plastic tents. Once we got used to the sirens blaring, we would take the video camera and go up on the roof to film. Their roof was flat and we often had parties up there. Now it became the perfect place to catch a glimpse of the incoming Scuds. And if we were really lucky, we got to see the Patriot missiles come shooting up, trying to stop the Scuds mid-air. It was cheap entertainment for us teenagers and something to talk about at school the next day. The war came to an undramatic end and life resumed its regular routine. The biggest impact that the Gulf War had on me was actually an academic one. With so many students leaving, the school wasn't able to run its usual classes. It meant that I had missed more than half of my school year. Since my classes were missed because of the war, I was given full credit for the classes that I never took. It just so happened that I had held off taking all the hard subjects like chemistry and physics and science for as long as possible. Now I had been granted full credit and I hadn't done any of the work. I also found out that I had qualified to do my English O and A-level exams as English as a second language student. By now my English was pretty much fluent. There were obvious gaps, but not many. According to the rules, I could do the easier versions of the exam and I passed with top grades. The principal had a chat with me. If I was to put in some extra effort over the next year and my grades were high, I would not just graduate with top marks, I could actually graduate a year early. This would mean that I could have some time off between high school and my looming Army service that was quickly approaching. I was stunned. My schooling had been a mishmash up until now. My first year of school in Sweden was fairly straightforward, but besides learning to read and write, my mind had never been engaged. I then homeschooled with Johanna, which consisted of eating lots of mud cake batter and doing chores. I had the occasional English lesson with my mother, which didn't improve my English skills in the slightest. I then went to Hebrew school for 2 years, which meant another couple of years of not learning anything, besides had to occupy my mind for hours on end with total silence. Then my first couple of years at the Anglican school was really just about getting used to having English as my main language and getting my head around everything that was happening around me. So yeah, me being studious was a very vague concept, and it wasn't as if being a beach bum really called for high grades. However, here was this other motivation. It could mean an early exit from school, squeezing 12 years into 11. Thanks to the Gulf War, it meant doing that minus the subjects that I hated. At the same time, I had been invited to come and stay with a family in Oregon. They did puppet ministry in Jerusalem every year for the children who attended the Feast of Tabernacles conference, and they were very keen for me to join them and travel through Oregon to different churches and tell kids about Jesus using puppets. How could I resist that offer? School took on a whole new meaning, and all of a sudden I was getting top grades in all of my subjects. I had no idea that if I actually wanted to, I could be a good student. Not long after that, I was able to graduate a year early. My report was glowing. I knew I had Saddam to thank. I couldn't have done it without him.